Well, wonderful. Hey, we'll kick off at this point. So, folks, wonderful to have you here. I am Oliver Bruce. I'm the host of the Micromobility podcast. Very excited to be welcoming Hayden Clarkin and Daniel Brennan. Daniel's with Zoba, which is a very cool company. I'm sure they're going to do a little bit of, they'll do a little brief on what you guys do, Daniel. But I do want to just say from the get-go, I've been very Zoba exists as a service for being able to improve the shared operations and being able to exactly what we're going to talk about today, bridge that operator and city divide. Hayden, welcome. Such a pleasure to have you. As I was mentioning earlier, he is the transit guy on Twitter. One of the like in my view, one of the best urbanists on Twitter. So
thank you. Appreciate it.
If you don't. But otherwise, look, folks, I'm going to leave you to it. I'm going to get out of the way and just leave you to have a wonderful conversation. If you do have questions, do chuck them in the chat, and I'll pop back in about 15 minutes or so, and we can go from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Oliver. Appreciate it. All right. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you here. As Oliver mentioned, I'm Dan Brennan. I'm one of the co-founders of Zoba. We provide demand forecasting and optimization software for shared mobility and delivery companies around the world, helping them make more money in their vehicles while adhering to regulations and lowering costs. And I promise you that will be the end of my pitching. We're here to talk about cities. So I'm joined today by Hayden Clarkin. Many of you will know him as the Transit Guy on Twitter. I'll ask him to introduce himself in a second. But we're here to discuss how cities and shared mobility operators can better find a relationship that is beneficial to both sides. And to set the stage a little bit, I think this is a really timely discussion because it feels like in the industry we're at a bit of a crossroads. So these services have been around long enough for cities to begin to have a strong opinion one way or the other about the operators themselves and how they should be regulated. And some relevant current examples, the city of Paris, often touted as city at the forefront of the anti-car revolution, has announced that a public vote, upcoming public vote, will actually determine the future of these operators within Paris, which I'm sure is a little bit scary for people on this call, but also exciting. Japan is easing regulations on shared scooters, which is opening up a massive market and allowing new entrants into the space. Super exciting. LA is remaining fairly unregulated to the point that several operators have actually left the market as it was so difficult for them to find positive unit economics in such a competitive environment. And finally, many operators are publicly pulling out of markets in large regions of the world that they feel like they cannot be profitable in, either because of regulations or competition and so on. And I think all of these things combined with what will inevitably be a tighter funding environment in 2023 means that this, like I will do anything attitude of operators and their ability to adhere to burdensome regulations is going to decay pretty hard. And so more so than ever, the ability for operators and cities to find some symbiosis and will determine the future of the space, especially as many smaller municipalities will probably follow suit with larger cities like Paris over the next year. So I think a timely discussion and excited to have Hayden here, and I think it'll be a good one. Hayden, do you mind introducing yourself quickly and maybe a little bit about your background?
Sure. Well, thank you, Dan, for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Hayden. I go by the Transit Guy online. Some of you might know me there, I guess. But yeah, I started off studying in Germany public transportation operation and urban and regional planning. I've worked on both coasts, working on high-speed rail on both coasts, a bunch of subway projects, road projects, complete street projects, bus projects, transit projects, ferry projects, you kind of name it. And then I kind of took a stab probably in mid-pandemic of going into the micromobility space. Really loved it, really enjoyed finding kind of the roots of being an engineer and a planner, working on a public good and figuring out how to kind of mirror that with micromobility. And it really, really enjoyed it. And now I rant on Twitter, I guess is the correct way to say it. I scream at the sky. And I work as a consultant as the transit guy with multiple transit agencies and clients and tech clients. So hit me up. So I'm really excited to be here and talk a little bit about regulations and city relations and how we can be better operators.
Absolutely. And Hayden, I think it's super awesome to have you here, especially because you kind of bridge the divide, right? You've been an operator and you've been on the city side. So super excited. So I mean, to start out, let's just like take a step back and kind of talk to the basics here. In your opinion, what has to be in place both on the operator side and the city side for there to be a successful relationship?
Yeah, that's a really great question. One of the things that I find to be important, and I think this is important just in life with any sort of client or any sort of relationship, is you move at the speed of trust. Moving at the speed of trust with an operator in a city relationship is really important. A lot of times, I can speak for myself and my own experience. A lot of times we've seen micromobility pilots where they just dump a bunch of mobility devices in the middle of the night, and it's never worked out well, ever. And so kind of working with the city, approaching the city of, hey, this is what we're working on, this is what we want to do. And one of the biggest things is aligning outcomes. I live in New York City. Civil servants are the lowest they've been in a couple of decades. And so the city is strapped. And working and approaching this market like New York City and coming in and saying, here's where we can provide value, here's where we can help. Bridging that gap, both in a profitability standpoint on your own end, but also leading with an outcome that really can help the city or any city bridge some of those bureaucratic gaps is huge, and especially in today's day and age.
Yeah, I think that moving at the speed of trust is a really salient point. I think especially because regardless of what we want the reality to be, we're all operating in kind of a post-Uber world in the opinion of cities, and so you're kind of starting out a little bit lower on the trust scale. And so I think there are definitely regulations out there like iterative caps and things like that that can allow us to kind of build trust as we go. I mean, I think I would say, like, along your point very similarly, that I think shared incentives is the path forward here, the way to solve all these problems. I mean, it's no secret what operators want. They want to look at a city and say there is a path to profitability in this city, and usually that comes through regulation, right? Caps and limited limits to competition. And also, like, cities, no secret what they want. They want to limit the negative externalities of these services and either decrease car usage or kind of work to cut carbon emissions. And there's no reason that if you do move at the speed of trust and you build the right types of regulations, you can achieve both those things. I think both of them call for regulation. I think often we find ourselves in the biggest problems in unregulated markets.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Keep going. No, sorry. Please go to the next question. It works.
I was done. Oh, I was just going to say, kind of on that point, like, what would be your kind of recommendations to operators on how they should be engaging cities? How do they start the right relationship, and how do they kind of keep that going over time?
Yeah. So as I kind of said a little bit, make sure you do your homework. Don't treat every market the same. That's imperative, especially something that worked in Boston might not work in New York. Exactly how it's been implemented, and that's really important. Unfortunately, politics are politics, and so we kind of sometimes have to live by them. But also, I think it's really important that operators and those in tech, we realize that, like, sometimes that we come up with a solution looking for a problem, right? That doesn't always, that solution that you bring to a city needs to be tweaked and iterated. I worked on a project where we provided first last mile service to a subway station in Eastern Queens. And the biggest issue that we had was that a lot of the people along the route, while the city was happy that we were providing that, we only took digital payment in a transit desert. It really provided, it was a huge friction point between elected officials and policymakers responding to, hey, this isn't working for us because you're endorsing this, and now we can't use it because we're unbanked or we don't have digital means of currency. And that was a really big policy issue that we kind of had to address and figure out, how can we amend this solution? Because the solution worked elsewhere, but it worked where people were higher banked and had a higher means of banking, and here we didn't. And trying to figuring out how we can better suit the needs of both us as a private operator and also the city was something we definitely had to do. And it's important going forward, especially when you're trying to build those relationships, and you don't want to burn those bridges, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really solid example of, like, if maybe how to make a mistake early, like how to do it wrong. Maybe don't match your constituents or your users where they're at, like, economically or on the banking strat. I mean, do you have any examples that you've seen of operators taking steps that like made a difference or were more effective?
Yeah, actually, so when we were working with the operators in Eastern Queens, all of the drivers were gig workers. They own their own vehicles, and we were working with them to provide this service. We found out that the cost of insurance was so prohibitively expensive in the New York market, and it hurt our bottom line, but it also hurt these individual gig worker drivers to do other work outside of us. And so we led the charge at the State House with advocates to work on insurance regulations at the State House to make meaningful change that would both affect our bottom line and make the market more amenable to profitability for us, but also at the same time really showing drivers and really showing council members and stuff that like we were here for the long run to really help bridge that gap and lead the charge versus just pulling out of the market and abandoning these drivers who had been giving us so much of their time and effort into this product. And it really paid off multiple times over.
That's a really good example. I like that. I mean, I think just to drop another example that more maybe on the scooter side, I think that one thing that I liked recently was, you know, when all the hullabaloo was going around about Mayor Hidalgo canceling scooter permits in Paris, the operators in Paris went out and just started making changes based on what they thought the city wanted to see proactively, kind of before they were pushed down. So like, you know, obviously Lime, Tier, and Dot. They went out and popped license plates on all vehicles, you know, even though they weren't necessarily required to at the time, to make it easier to cite specific vehicles and identify misuse. And they implemented ID verification ahead of time. I think that kind of speaks back to what you were saying about going at the speed of trust, right? Like they were like, okay, we get there's some mistrust, there's some issues here, you know, even before we're being regulated, we can show that we can implement, you know, different steps to make sure that we're doing, our users are doing what they need to be doing.
And I will say it's frustrating in this space sometimes when you move so quick. We're in a space that moves so quick all the time. It's really hard to then hit against those bureaucratic walls. But if you do work within those limits and you do really make an effort, it actually pays off more than kind of like just dropping scooters in the middle of the night and hoping for the best.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah. And to kind of flip that question on its head, I mean, I think we see cities where like they're like massively overregulated, where like operators are told like exactly where they can put vehicles, and like it's probably doesn't match well with reality and where people actually need vehicles. And we see the opposite, like we're talking about in LA, where complete lack of regulation makes it hard to operate. I mean, how do you think city officials can better include operators maybe in their policy planning decisions and so that you know actual regulation comes out in a way that's beneficial to both sides?
Yeah, again, I think it's operators working on leading with outcomes first and societal outcomes first. Obviously, we're all profit-driven entities, but we don't lead with the profitability to like stakeholders and policy leaders. But what are we trying to do? Okay, well, we are trying to bridge the first last mile gap that you're dealing with. MTA is strapped for resources right now and is facing a deficit. This can do X measurable effect in this neighborhood, this neighborhood, this neighborhood. We've done our homework. We found out that these are the biggest transit deserts in the city. Here's what we can do. Does this work for you? Yes, it works for us. Okay, let's align on this outcome, which also serves our bottom dollar versus, hey, do us this favor because. So like working to really work with these outcomes is really important for sure.
Any cities you want to call out as being particularly impressive with kind of how they've executed their regulatory framework?
Yeah, I know you've brought up Paris with and some of the friction that's gone on there. I will say Jersey City has done a micromobility pilot with Via, and it went from, I believe, 10 vehicles during the pandemic. They're up to 36 now. And one of the great things that Via does is that if you are with you pay per mile, you know, to go anywhere in this flex zone of the city. But if you're going to a transit hub, you get half of your you get half of a discount. It's a 50% of the fare, because that aligns with the first last mile goals that Jersey City has, and so Via works with the city on that because that's the outcomes that they're aligned with, right? And so that's a really good example, and they've done really well, and they keep expanding. So yeah, I'll hand it over to you, Dan, if there's any examples that you would like to bring up.
Yeah, I'll call out one before Oliver hops in. I think that when you go to DC, it feels like micromobility is a part of the culture and really like a very legitimate form of transit there. It feels different than some other cities. And I think the way they've done the regulation is super impressive, and it aligns incentives between operators in cities. Like one, it's an iterative cap with limited operators. So you start out with 750 vehicles, and if you show you can put rides on those vehicles, you can build that up to 5,000. And then the second thing is that they allow operators to waive their fees, their permit fees, if they can prove a certain level of low income ridership. Yep. Which I think, again, aligns incentives really well and says, like, show me, don't tell me. Like, if you can actually get the kind of people that we think need these services on them, then you don't have to pay us the money. And so it's not necessarily a form of subsidy, but it's essentially is that, and I think is super powerful and,
yep.
and a good example for a lot of other cities. But,
totally makes sense.
I think we're about up on time.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for listening. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
You're most welcome. Can you guys hear me?
Thank you, Hayden.
Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, look, this has been great. I love this discussion. And I think I won't jump in and say anything other than to say I'm really excited that the two of you got a chance to talk. Because does this happen frequently, or is this like a relatively new conversation?
We found each other through the ether.
And I just creepily follow him on Twitter.
Yeah.
So I think they call me a lurker, is what they would call that.
Yeah. Check with my building security tonight.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much for this conversation, because I think you guys are right on about exactly everything that you're right on the cutting edge of talking about what's interesting in the space. I'm waiting until some large transit agency really is just like, we're going to actually give micromobility a run and treat it like we treat our buses and our trains and all these other sort of things. And there hasn't been one yet that I've found anywhere in the world that's really given it a go. So when that happens, I think, I'll give the historical context as well, which is like no real kind of large organized transport system has ever existed without public funding. So it's like, if we want these things to work, we should really be talking about how to fund it. Yeah. And speaking of public funding, I want to say thank you to these two, but also if you're interested in that conversation, we do have a session with Grace Rink from Denver, who's been doing the e-bike rebate program, which is very interesting. That's going on in our other sessions. But yeah, before you head off, I just want to say to these two, Daniel and Hayden, thank you so much for that. That was a great conversation, and really looking forward to hopefully having more of them.
Thanks, Oliver. Thanks, Dan. I'll talk to you all later.
Thanks, Oliver. Thanks, Hayden.